All right, here we go. So my name is Ariel Gordon, and I am the publicity and promotions coordinator at University of Manitoba Press in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. We are here today to launch Karen Marrero's book, Detroit's Hidden Channels, The Power of French-Indigenous Families in the 18th Century. So here's a look at the cover. University of Manitoba Press is publishing the Canadian edition of this book. It's also available in the United States from Michigan State University Press. So a few things are going to happen here. I am going to do a land acknowledgement. I'm going to remind you about the discount codes, both from Michigan State University Press and from us to purchase the book. I'm going to intro our two guests today, and I'm going to do, did I say a land acknowledgement? Because that's what I'm going to do. All right, so why don't I start with that? I know from the poll and from the chat that you are joining us from all over, but U of M Press and where I sit, we are in Treaty 1 territory. And so I'm going to read you the land acknowledgement that we use for everything. And you can think about what Indigenous peoples live where you are. Anyways, University of Manitoba Press is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. U of M Press respects the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes in the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. All right. So the next thing I'm going to do is welcome up our two guests. They've been kind enough to join us. First of all, Kathryn Magee Labelle. She is an associate professor of Indigenous history at the University of Saskatchewan and an adopted member of the Wyandot Nation of Kansas. Her research centers on the Wendat, Wyandot, Huron communities of North America, with particular interest in settler colonialism, Indigenous identity, and experiences of women from the 17th century to the present. Labelle is the author of the book Dispersed but Not Destroyed, A History of the 17th Century Wendat People, UBC Press 2013, and co-editor of From Huronia to Wendakes. I'm sorry, I hope I got that right. Adversity, Migration, and Resilience, 1650 to 1900, OU Press 2016. Her current research is a collaborative project with the Wendat Women's Advisory Council entitled Daughters of Aitiansik, that explores the lives of 7 Wendat women from the 17th to the 21st centuries. Guillaume Teasdale is an assistant professor and undergraduate advisor in the Department of History at the University of Windsor. He is also an associate at the Wilson Institute for Canadian History at McMaster University. A specialist in the French presence in the interior of North America in the 18th and 19th centuries, he co-edited French and Indians in the Heart of North America, 1630 to 1815, with Michigan United, which came out with Michigan State University Press in 2013, and also with U of M Press. And Une Amérique Française, 1760 to 1860, Dynamique du Corridor Créole, which came out with Les Indes Savantes in 2015. In 2019, he published his first monograph, Fruits of Perseverance, the French Presence in the Detroit River Region, 1701 to 1815, which came out with McGill Queen's University Press. He has recently co-authored with Karen L. Marrero an article to be published in the anthology French Connections, Cultural Mobility in North America and the Atlantic World, 1600 to 1875, which will be coming out with Louisiana State University Press in 2020. Could you please welcome Kathryn Magee Labelle and Guillaume Teasdale.
Thanks so much, Ariel, for those introductions. So I'm Katie, and over there, or over there, I don't know how your screens are, is Guillaume, and we are your moderators for today's event. to begin, I would also like to do some acknowledgements. Is that okay, Guillaume?
Oh yeah.
Okay. We sort of have this planned. So I'd also like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I live on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis here in Saskatoon. I pay respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of Treaty 6 and seek to reaffirm my relationship with this place and people through my professional practice and personal daily life. Also worth noting are my relationships with other places and people of Turtle Island or North America. For instance, although I have lived in Treaty 6 territory for almost a decade now, I was raised and have spent most of my life on the unceded territory of the Shabbat-Abajuan First Nation in Ontario. In addition, my work and honorary kinship ties with the Wendat Confederacy have allowed me to make unique connections to the modern communities of the Wendat of Anderton Nation, located in the Detroit-Windsor corridor, the Huron-Wendat of Quebec, the Wendat Nation in Oklahoma, and the Wendat Nation of Kansas. Today's book launch and Karen's work cannot be separated from these land acknowledgements. Her focus on family, kinship, land, and women pay respect to the long history of Indigenous and settler people on this continent, highlighting deep relationships and ancestral connections. I've known of Karen's research for many years now and had the pleasure of crossing paths with her in person at conferences and other scholarly events. She's helped me in so many ways, providing feedback on papers, sending archival references, and unraveling incredibly confusing genealogies of Detroit River Wendat women. Before meeting her, a colleague and friend of ours, Robert Engelbert, who I see is here today, told me, quote, "You will never meet another academic as kind and generous as Karen," end quote. He wasn't wrong, but I would also add that not only is she kind and generous, but she is sharp, strong, and determined. Women scholars face unique challenges in this profession, and it is role models like Karen that see us through. And so it goes without saying that I am incredibly honored to participate today in this event and celebrate the tremendous contribution that is Detroit's Hidden Channels. So with that, I will turn it over to Guillaume, and then we're going to begin the official programming for today.
Thank you, Katie. I would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous traditional territory here. I'm currently on campus at the University of Windsor, Ontario, across from Detroit. And the University of Windsor sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fire Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. And I would add that it also sits on a tract of land once occupied by the Huron-Wendat. And I'm really grateful for Karen to inviting me to participate in this amazing event today. I'm also very honored. I've been working on the project with Karen for more than a couple of years now. We've known each other for more than a decade, I believe. And but we are working more together on your projects. And I'm very excited to be here today, and I'm very excited for the conversation that we're going to have later on in the next few minutes.
So with that, just to give the audience a bit of an idea of the structure for today, we're going to invite Karen onto the stage briefly in a few moments. And she's going to, oh, there she is. Yay. Oh, and she's, there she is. So Karen's going to do a brief reading from her book, so you get a sneak peek if you don't already have it. And then that's going to be followed by some questions that Guillaume and I have for Karen. taking advantage of our moderator position. So that will happen for roughly about a half an hour, and then we're going to open the floor up to you guys. So if you do have questions, I think Ariel mentioned in the beginning, you can write those not in the chat section, but in the question and answer tab at the bottom of your page. And Guillaume and I will pick and choose from that selection at the end. All right, so without further ado, I hand it over to Dr. Kathryn Marrero.
Katie, thank you so much. And Guillaume, way to make me cry before I start talking. Thank you for all of the kind words. I want to start first before I just say a few words about the moderators for this event. I want to acknowledge with gratitude that I live and work on the ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Wendat nations. I'm grateful for the opportunity to gather on this land, to share knowledge across diverse communities, and co-create a better future for the earth and each other. So in giving this acknowledgement, I'm not physically actually on the campus of Wayne State, that's in Midtown Detroit, and I'm a little farther north in a suburb, but the acknowledgement goes for both places. I am so happy to be here. I'm happy and I am honored. Excited that my book is being published by an American and a Canadian publisher, because I'm a dual citizen. My work crosses that border. It's the same for the moderators of this session. Katie and Guillaume do work that is very transnational. So this could not have gone better for me in terms of this first monograph coming out. Katie has been helpful. I turned to Katie for information pertaining to early Wendat people for my book, and I have cited her work most gratefully. And definitely the same goes for Guillaume. And Guillaume has been very generous about including me and my students in grant applications and grant-based work that he's doing. Seeing that this international border that he and I share, this Windsor-Detroit border, is a very fluid one, which is something I was hoping to show in my work. So I'm going to read just a short excerpt. It was very hard for me to choose which one I would read. And I'll only read for about 5 minutes, but I chose to read from an excerpt in the middle of the book, in a series of chapters that I'm particularly proud of that have to do with sort of rewriting a historic event that historians and scholars will know as Pontiac's War, which has been traditionally written from a white male perspective, mostly a British white male perspective. And almost accidentally, in doing the work for this book, I came across a woman who was at the center of the story. And I think there's more to be discovered about her. And I hope people pick up that baton, so to speak. So I'm going to start my book. I've had several chapters talking about French and Indigenous presence before the French arrived, long before the French arrived in 1701. And then I spent a little bit of time talking about that early French presence and how integral its survival was to its relationship with local Indigenous communities through the families I talk about. So this sort of starts with the closing of the 7 Years' War. The British have, expect to move into places like Detroit and sort of take over. And they expect that this will be a smooth process. At least that's their expectations. So I'm going to pick up there. In March 1761, only a few months into British occupation of the formerly French-held fort at Detroit, newly installed Commandant Donald Campbell penned a letter to his superiors. His missive was written in English and French and was devoted in equal parts to the logistics of established British military protocols and musings on local people and events. According to Campbell, local women, and I'm going to use a lot of air quotes here, according to Campbell, local women surpassed his expectations, although he considered the man very indifferent. an occurrence he had never before witnessed, drew particular notice, which he described in French. Il y a assemblé tous les dimanches au soir chez Monsieur le Commandant, où ici trouve une vingtaine de personnes de du sexe. There is a gathering every Sunday night in the home of the commander, where there are to be found about 20 people of both sexes. He proclaimed of the event, "You have no such doings at Fort Pitt." Switching from English to French, as he had in his letter to the Swiss-born Colonel Henry Bouquet, his superior, Campbell transitioned from the public voice of martial observation to the coded whisper of more private reflection. This pattern of intermittent personal disclosure in British imperial correspondence in the period immediately following the 7 Years' War suggests general uncertainty and guarded vulnerability. Fort Pitt had been a British installation from its establishment in 1758, and social conventions there had followed British norms. But at Detroit, the weekly cultural event Campbell described had a different precedent, and its participants would not be deterred by a change in leadership or empire. Nowhere could this insistence on tradition be more compellingly enacted than in Campbell's home, a space that for all intents and purposes remained under French control. The new British commandant was renting his quarters from the former French commandant, François-Marie Picotet de Balestre, who was a member of the French Indigenous Family Networks and son of Procuratrice Marie-Kathryn Trottier des Ruisseaux by her second husband. In describing the exceptional attributes of local women in his letter, Campbell might have been referencing the essential role in trade played by women such as Marie-Kathryn. He may also have been describing their physical appearance and commenting on their sexual natures. In either case, the women of Detroit, more powerful than their male kinsmen in the eyes of the British, freely entered the quarters of the new commandant, a space they would continue to control. Campbell's comments also tell us that British expectations of proper gendered behavior differed from those of local peoples at Detroit. The mixing of men and women was a potential threat to the new imperial order, as had been the mixing of French indigenous blood that had threatened the French imperial state several decades earlier. Campbell seemed unaware of or unconcerned with potential ramifications of these cultural differences. Within a year, however, he appeared to be regretting his openness with the local populace. He said, "It requires judgment and temper to command at one of these posts," he wrote in 1762. "The French inhabitants and Indians are so much connected that if you disoblige one of them, the other takes part. I begin to know the people too well," he commented darkly. "I do not think they improve on a long acquaintance." I love that sentence. So it was not the first, nor would it be the last time British elites spoke disparagingly of French and indigenous peoples. Historians have traced these early ruminations through May of 1763, when the Odawa leader Pontiac and warriors of Great Lakes nations brought down all British occupied installments in the upper country, except for Forts Detroit, Pitt, and Niagara. Pontiac's war generated realms of correspondence, much of it produced by British military agents frustrated by the lack of information emanating from Detroit, a location at the apex of the disturbance. The reality of Indigenous and French women's activities at Detroit was much more complex than these histories would have us believe. Not only were these women often operating as diplomatic representatives and political operatives, they also managed the trade on which Indigenous Euro-American relations depended. Because they often controlled both of these essential components, they just as often became the targets of censure and accusation. So I'll stop there. As a way, I think that quote sort of generally says, and I can answer more questions and get into more details, all these sort of mutable gendered categories and how Euro-imperial agents didn't really understand their nuances. And particularly when the British came in, they weren't actually able to read this complex landscape very well, which led to Pontiac's war. So I'm going to stop there and we can continue with our program.
Thanks so much, Karen. That's one of my favorite chapters. So if you don't have the book, that was a very tantalizing snippet of a really powerful chapter. So Guillaume and I have prepared some questions for our author today, inspired by the book and also our own research and sort of just general intrigue in the topic. Guillaume, I'll do one and then you do one?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. So the first question that I have, Karen, is really general. And I'm not even sure that even in all of our encounters, I've really gotten a straight answer about this. So I'm wondering, how did you get interested in this topic?
Thank you for that question, Katie. As I know, you and Guillaume definitely know this, and as maybe most of the audience do know. And before I answer, I've been watching the chat, and I know not everybody has put their names on the chat, but there are a lot of people I know who are here, and I want to thank you all for your support and for being here for me. It means a lot to me, so thank you for that. So this was a dissertation, as many academic first books are, and it was a dissertation that took me quite a number of years to finish. So the project has been unfolding for more than 20 years, and probably 25 years. So this started as an interest. I'm born and raised in Windsor, and I'm grew up at part of the historical early French community that was part of Windsor. And there were a lot of stories that were told in my family by my mother and my grandparents. And I would hear snippets of things that piqued my curiosity. And I also I didn't learn any of this history in school at the time. I didn't know anything about the history of the region I was in. So it really started as just wanting to know more about the history of the place I had grown up in, and how sort of getting a better handle on what this history was could help me sort of connect oral stories and songs, which I use in the book, with some of this larger history, which I did not know yet. Hope that's specific enough.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, my turn. We use Karen and I think we use and sometimes like similar methodologies or approaches about looking at specific individuals. So my question is, I am personally a big fan of microhistory. However, I find it sometimes difficult to link, for example, the story of specific individuals to a more global history. But that's something that your book does very, very well. Can you tell us more about how you succeeded in finding such a good balance between the local and the global?
Oh, well, thank you, Guillaume. I was blessed with having, on one hand, sort of a good cache of records I could turn to. So, and also some good local scholarship that had been done by local historians and local genealogical historians, who I am greatly indebted to. So I was able, for example, to look at church records, to locate the names and descriptions of particular people, and then sort of take some of those names and go looking. And increasingly, over the course of this 20 years I was working on this project, a lot of material by the National Archives of Canada was digitized. So what I early on in this project, I'd gone to the Ottawa region to be able to visit those archives and look at them. But then towards the end of the project, I was able to sort of get online, and there's so much of that original material that is available there. And very good people at the National Archives who wrote a lot of abstracts, which were searchable and very detailed. So I was actually able to find individuals. And then I did a lot of reading to provide much needed context, including your book, Guillaume, and to be able to place all of these people in the proper perspective, right? So, and because it is a transnational history, I was, reading authors, some of which are here, some of the people who are here today. I noticed Lucy Murphy is here and Monty is here as well, to read scholarship on both sides of the border and sort of tie these people together. Sometimes you would, I think the best example of this would be the excitement I would feel when I'd find somebody who was in sort of primary records in French, for example, and who had a lot of material written about him because he was getting in a lot of trouble. Those are the people who are recorded in the archives. And then to sort of go to work that was being done by people in working on the Illinois country, the French Illinois country, including Robert Engelbert, who's here today as well, and find him in records there. And then I was rereading James Merrill's book on Pennsylvania, and found, his name is Michel Biséon, and find him there, except Merrill hadn't sort of put him together from the Pennsylvania archives with what I was finding in the French archives in Canada. And it turns out he was operating on for both governments at the same time in the same place. But most scholars don't know this because they follow him here or they follow him there. So long-winded answer to sort of say, I'm definitely a microhistorian, and I'm teaching a class right now on microhistory, so I'm getting into this. That following individuals, I think, is very fruitful because it turns up things I might not have found out, but properly contextualizing this with good histories, absolutely essential, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So your answer to that question is a good segue for my next question, which is that often when we become attached to the people, often we do become attached to the people that we research, especially when we're researching this for, years, right? And so I'm wondering, is there one person who stands out to you in this book as particularly close to your heart, and why?
Terrific question. Because we do become emotionally attached, right? We wouldn't be good historians if we didn't. That has changed to some extent over the 20 years I've been working on this project. When you do work on individuals, even people who do some things you don't necessarily agree with from a 21st century perspective, you do feel a certain sort of connection to them. But I would really say, going back to what the reading that I did at the beginning of this, that the two women at the center of this story, this women-centered story of Pontiac's War, and particularly Kathryn, because there was a French woman, Angélique Thibault-Bien, who was maybe the person involved. It depends on what history you're reading and who's writing it. And there was Kathryn, who was described as either being Potawatomi or Ojibwe. So I really became quite attached to Kathryn because I kept finding descriptions of her, or descriptions I inferred were probably about her, across time and across multiple accounts written by antiquarians and by men. And so nobody that I know of has written about her and written about the fact that this probably was an event that started because of the activities of this particular woman, who we still don't know exactly who she is. But there's a lot of violence around her story, and I talk about that in the book. And that also was emotionally evocative for me to read about that violence. and also to try and write about that, you know, without continuing this tradition of just describing violence supposedly perpetrated by Indigenous people and not properly contextualizing all of the violence that occurred. So there was violence she actually probably experienced, and violence that was experienced by men who were writing about her in the centuries following. So the fact that people are still talking about her, Lewis Cass, Henry Rose Schoolcraft are talking about her over 100 years after this event, and going into detail about her appearance and about how she died and what a bad person she was, leads me to believe she was an incredibly powerful woman. And we need to know more about her. Maybe there's more to be found out there. I'm leaving that open for somebody.
That's wonderful. I think Lucy Murphy once gave me a magnet that I have on my fridge that says something like, good women rarely make history. Not, you know the saying?
Yes, I do know that.
I'm upstairs right now and look at it, but that's what I have going through my mind, that that's your Kathryn, right?
Yes.
You gotta be a rebel. You gotta be a rebel to make it on the page.
Absolutely. I agree with that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
My next question is also about finding individuals, specific individuals in the sources, and tracking down some of these individuals. In your research, did you meet other people than those mentioned in your book, whether Indigenous, French, or mixed ancestry, whose stories seem quite relevant and fascinating, but for whom the content of the sources was unfortunately too limited to flesh out your ideas further? A few examples. You're like, oh, this exactly, it supports my ideas. Just any other individuals?
Great question. I think one thing, especially when you work at such a micro level, there was so much I didn't do in this book, and it's part of the reason why I wanted the two of you here, because I started sort of on a project following a particular couple, two particular people, a man who was French and a Myaamia woman he married. So I ended up doing a lot of work, gaining a perspective on the Myaamia presence, on Myaamia Nation, and have used a lot of materials available through the Myaamia Nation in Miami University in Ohio, great blogs by George Ironstrack. I have to mention this. So in choosing to take that route, there were things I didn't end up doing, and then it became, I got to get promotion and tenure. I got to finish this book kind of thing. So there, I talk to some extent about the Wendat community, a strong, burgeoning community full of people, Wendat people who were integral to Detroit's story, but not as much, I'm going to tell people, please go to Katie's book and the work she's doing right now to properly understand that. Because some of the people I'm talking about too had multiple sort of, I'm talking about the French people I'm talking about had multiple sort of connections to multiple Indigenous nations, right? Because that network of people was relatively small, but the geographic distance over which they stretched was quite large, which the map that Ellen White made for me, that's at the beginning of my book, I tried to sort of capture that, sort of ranging from Montreal all the way down to New Orleans and every place in between. So I felt that I had to leave some people and some parts of the story aside, which I regret. I looked at Pierre Poitier's great records, which are invaluable for people doing work, as Katie can say, on the historic Wendat presence. And I even mentioned, one of the people I mentioned, and this is what Katie had helped me with, was sort of he shows up in Poitier's records. He's not Wendat, but he obviously is in a position where he's seen as being integral to the community because the Wendat give him a Wendat name. And I wanted to translate it. So I'm, emailing Katie and saying, can you help me with this? And so she called on her resources. So I think I'm not answering your question, Guillaume. But
Well, no, you are. I know that there's a lot of people in the audience that relate to what you say in your book, and that it would be, potentially examples, of other stories that could be added, to your research. So, but it's never ending. There's always something, yeah.
definitely, and I had to, and folks out there know this, that I'm in trying to sort of connect people across sources. I made some what I hope are based on the work done by local genealogical historians and my own work. I'm sure I've made some mistakes, but trying to sort of find people across records meant I had to make some suppositions. I tried really hard to make sure I was making educated suppositions. So that's there too. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guillaume.
So Karen, you had mentioned the map at the beginning, and those, very extensive networks geographically. And so my next question for you is about your descriptions of the physical landscape around Detroit, which I found to be extremely powerful and also instructive for your reader. So I'm wondering, what part, if any, did the landscape and geography play in your writing or analytical process?
Thank you for that question, Katie. So I was trying to do a lot of things in this book, and I didn't do them all successfully. I did some of them pretty well and some not too bad. And so I was trying to also incorporate this and try to wrap my head around this sort of concept of Detroit as place, right? And all of us who have worked in this area or lived in this area, and that includes both of you, understand it. It's a place people talk about moving through, right? I remember always hearing, oh, Windsor, or oh, Detroit, I've been through there, I've been through there, I've been through there. And I said, what does that mean to be talking about being, moving through a place as opposed to being in a place? And then, sort of growing up and also going back to family stories I had heard, which are very water focused, right? Stories in my family, there are fishermen in my family and accidents that happened that involve things to do with the water in the Detroit River or Lake St. Clair. So it's a very water focused region. And, a few local scholars have talked about the point, and Guillaume and I in our work talked to this, that both sides of the river look inward towards each other, right? I know growing up in Windsor, I felt less connected to Toronto or London, and my father's American too, so that's part of it, but I felt more connected to that river and to what was on the other side. So I think that, coming to terms with my own experience with the landscape and multiple stories, right? The multiple stories I had heard about it and what it said about that topography, and understanding too that this was part of a larger, Detroit's part of that. I've been, Ariel showed the map and we've been talking about this, that there's this unique quality Detroit has where everything narrows, right? I mean, even now, even though it's a much wider river than it ever was, you can easily see the other side of it. And I'm, being able to put Detroit history into this larger context. And again, I'm sort of calling on the scholarship of Jay Gitlin and Robert Engelbert and Guillaume, talking about this river world, right? And talking about realizing how Detroit was part of this larger topography. And I guess I could go on about this for a long time, because I think I was trying to sort of talk about Detroit as a place of transitions. So deliberately trying to force this issue of it's a place, but a place you move through. Can we have both of these qualities sort of married with each other at the same time? So I think one thing I talk about in the introduction, and and again, you'll have to read the book to read the whole thing, is about, which became sort of a metaphor for what I was trying to do with the Shinae Kate, which I didn't know anything about the Shinae. I learned about it through my mother. She talked about the Shinae, going to the Shinae as a kid, right? Going to the Thames River or the Shinae. And I'm like, what is the Shinae, right? So I started doing research, and Marcel Beneteau, who's a local Windsor folklorist, and Peter Helford, who unfortunately passed away, and researching. They've done some linguistic work on this, and finding out that the Shinae is a very unique feature. It's on the cover of the book. People may not know this, but it's a tiny little stream leading off of Lake St. Clair, right?
You hold it up a little bit higher. There you go.
So it's right there.
Yeah.
And even on this map, which is an early 19th century map, it's still by English language cartographers. They're still calling it the hidden stream, the lost stream. And so I became really fascinated with this concept of lost parts of the topography or lost parts of the geography, and how this is a very local way of referring to Shinae as a local French term, and Guillaume can attest to this as well. And that it's not usually the word is Chanel in French for a channel. And I found out through doing research on other French communities along this French River world that there are other Shinaes, places in current day Missouri, for example. So this idea of a lost or hidden channel, a part of the topography that's hidden, became my metaphor for the type of history I was trying to write about this local community, these local communities that I thought, nobody's not talking about these communities. So I'm using geography in every way I can.
Beautiful. And the imagery, I mean, for me, somebody that has spent time in the area, but not, I would say not extensive time, you really get a sense, like you really draw us into that place. So beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. My next question is more about your approach to really using the available sources to try to really understand the Indigenous perspective, how important it is. So your book makes it very clear that in order to get a more complete picture of Detroit's 18th century history, it is imperative to try to better understand the Indigenous perspective on relations with the French and then the British. I know that you are also working on the Detroit area during the first half of the 19th century. Can you quickly give one or two examples of stories from the first half of the 19th century that can hardly be understood without this Indigenous perspective?
Thank you for that question, Guillaume. So another sort of local or sort of a family story originating as partly a family story sort of has launched me into this second book project, and made me think about mutable identities, right? French Indigenous identity. So the first part of your question, even for and of course what I'm doing is nothing new. I stand on the shoulders of other, including the two of you, other scholars who have found innovative ways to include and forefront Indigenous voices in this history, right? Even though they're not readily apparent in some of the European-based materials that we use to start off with. So because I did, as I mentioned before, sort of concentrate even more on the Myaamia, I had access to, like I said, some great histories, online histories that George Armstrong has written about. He's a language expert, so I was able to integrate that information in as well. So moving forward into the 19th century, my new favorite, I tell my students, my new favorite time period is the 1830s. So that's sort of where I'm going. And there is this sort of family story, which I've done a little bit more research on, and published a book chapter on, about a French man named Francois Drouillard, who is part of this family of that I'm writing about in the first book, they're living on Walpole, which is Anishinaabe territory, always has been, is now today, always will be. They are expelled at the 1839 from that island. They're from Walpole. It's a series of islands. And they go to live where I grew up. If you know Windsor, it's Lozon Road, Riverside Drive, that region. And there's a Drouillard Point is formed. And when the story, and we see it in some local newspapers, is that Francois, he's not Indigenous by blood, right? At least as far as we know. He's grown up in this Anishinaabe community, and he arrives in this sort of new home place, not knowing any French, not one word of French. He only speaks Anishinaabean. So I'm fascinated by that. This goes to one of the points that Katie and I had been talking about earlier, about how you define identity in this case. And so, and I wrote about this in the chapter, that so he's French, but he doesn't speak French. He only speaks Anishinaabean. And this is transpiring, this relocation of this family at the same time that the Upper and Lower Canada rebellions have broken out. And I know you and I have talked about this work. And the Indian Removal Act in the US is being enacted, and Indigenous people are being forced out. And so I'm interested in what's going on in this French family, because what also ends up happening after they leave Walpole, they become devout Catholics. They join the Saint Jean-Baptiste Society. These same men are dressing up, playing Indian, so to speak, to use Philip Deloria's term, in these pageants, right, that are developed by local French communities. So I'm very intrigued by what has happened, what's going on with this identity, with who they are or have been, and where, what's happening. And so what I want to do is put this in the larger context of the Upper Canada Rebellion, which, as we know, in Canadian history is seen as being a failure. But we all know it's much more complex than that. And a lot of what's going on the American and Canadian side is happening in Detroit and Windsor. And Potawatomi from Michigan are, there are local people, Euro-Americans, who are sort of trying to gather them up and get them out. And they're going to Canada. And most traditional American history sort of, once they leave the American stage, they're out of the story, right? But they're going to join family members they already have visited or know about. And they're just saying, we're not going west, we're going to join this community. And the Anishinaabe on Walpole invite them to come and join them. So we've got all these cross currents. Then I have found a Upper Canadian lieutenant governor who had just recently left Tasmania, and was again, we've got people writing about what he did in Tasmania, which was actually quite brutal to Indigenous local Aboriginal people there. So he's fresh off that stint as lieutenant governor in Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land is what the British called it. And he's coming to Upper Canada, and he's going to deal with this sort of movement of Native peoples locally. So I'm kind of interested, I've got to start looking at his correspondence. So it's a macro micro story. Am I capable of a macro story? The jury will remain out on that for now.
Okay, thank you.
That's amazing. I think we are about at the time that now we can turn it over to the audience, and I've been scanning the question and answer box. So I will remind people that if you do have questions, you can place them in there at the bottom of your screen. So Guillaume, are you okay if I take a peek and go through? All right. So Karen, the first question that we have from the audience is from McKelvey Kelly, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Saskatchewan. And she asks you, how do you look for women in largely colonial sources, especially Indigenous women? Is this process more complex in places like Detroit, where Indigenous people, families might hide their Indigenous identities. And you talked a little bit about that in some of the previous questions, but maybe do you have anything to add for McKelvey?
Great question. Thank you, McKelvey. I appreciate that question. You know, all of us, McKelvey, and I know you're doing this work too, you know, I'm going to say the obvious, that it's incredibly difficult and you're not going to find all the answers to the questions that you have. What I did in a number of cases, and let me just start off by saying that they were more present, even on the margins of imperial reports, French and British, than I would have expected to start with, which of course underlines my point and all of our knowledge that they're a lot more important than traditional American or Canadian histories purport them to be, right? So oftentimes, you know, there might be a term, like there was a woman named, in some of the early French correspondence named Labelle, and she was Odawa. And I was able, in reading about her, to figure out that she, in using the work, let me just do a brief segue, using the work of Heidi Stark, who's an Anishinaabe historian out of University of Toronto, and Brenda Child, who's also an Anishinaabe historian, to sort of understand a little bit about Anishinaabe women's roles, to be able to understand what might have been going on in that source I was looking at. So she's accepting gifts from French fur traders, and they're describing her as being the daughter of a chief, and doing this extra research in these other histories I'm telling you about. And again, I'm going to mention Lucy and Monty's work as well, understanding that she was a chief herself, right? And this was the case when I looked at Myaamia women. There were some early 19th century accounts by people like Trowbridge. You know, they went around collecting oral accounts from Indigenous people. So we have to sort of be careful about how we understand that. But they describe Myaamia women taking part in spiritual exercises that show how much power they had. So it's definitely, I think, a microhistorical lens when looking at Indigenous women is very, very useful. I mean, reading this scholarship from some of these great scholars, which helps you just sort of understand how much more complex their roles were, and then looking for individual women. Another example, I could go on forever, in my work was finding this Illinois Peoria leader named Chachagues in the French archives. And I kept seeing him, and he made more than one reference at more than one instance to a daughter who was carrying messages on behalf of the Vaudreuil, the French governor general, to the Peoria people. And Vaudreuil was giving her gifts. So I know it's going to be a painstaking process, and I'm sure it's already been a painstaking process for you, but retrieving the women, I really think you need to sort of go down to that level.
Wonderful and really important advice. Guillaume, are you okay if we just make our way down the question? Yeah? Okay. So the next question for you, Karen, is from Elizabeth. Recently, we can't, anyways, I know she just recently moved to Michigan, so.
Yes, I know that.
Yeah. She says, I am doing a lot of historical and genealogical research in the same place and time period you're discussing. What sources which deal with specific families would you recommend that I obtain? My work is primarily with the Wendat people.
I know who it is asking this question, and I know she's already doing the work she needs to be doing with Wendat, because I know Elizabeth also has been talking to Katie and to other members of the Wendat Nation. So starting with those stories, which you know, Elizabeth, is the place to start. I would also suggest that you do, I mean, you may already have a subscription to Michigan's Habitant Heritage, which is published by the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan. And they've done decades worth of really painstaking research and have corrected a lot of errors out there, including some I've made, about some of these women, not just French women, but women who sort of cross French Indigenous worlds. So I definitely urge you to have a look at their journal. They've been publishing for many years. The St. Anne's registers, you know, I use those a lot for my work, and they're nicely detailed, and they identify people usually by nation, and sometimes by name. I was amazed at how many Indigenous names I was able to retrieve from those church records. Going back to the book, that slave owned by Michel Biséan, and being able to sort of understand, with the help of the Myaamia and David Costa's work there, that he had a Myaamia, Illinois name. And I found reference to this slave in the French Imperial Archives, and I put 2 and 2 together, and I said, this is the slave, this is the man. He's 18 years old. His name is Joseph Nikichia, which means eagle, bald eagle in the Myaamia, Illinois language. And so I was able to sort of go from the church register back to the French Imperial records and figure out where this slave was meant to go, and where he ended up going. He had to be baptized because all slaves had to be baptized. So there was a resident priest at Detroit. So he was baptized there. Boom, there's a record, right?
Yeah, those baptismal records.
There's so many of people who are on this, you know, the 2 of you and a lot of the people who are on this chat right now, I know these records backwards and forwards. Of course, I get all these telephone calls while I'm talking.
They're calling it in. Thanks, Karen and Elizabeth, for that question. Next, we have Leslie, who is wondering if, Karen, you could talk a bit about the organization of archives and the challenges of finding and cataloging the materials that you've used.
Leslie, I think I know the archivist Leslie that this may be. So I'm trying to think about what I might not have already said in answer to this question, Leslie. That because, again, these are, and the 2 moderators understand these issues, that when you're trying to find materials in more than one country, there are challenges that go along with that. And there are, and I know I'm going to run across this specifically for the second project. There are a lot, the records I'm going to need to be accessing they're at the Bentley Library at the University of Michigan. They're going to be in the Burton Historical Collection in Detroit. You know, there's some Australian records. I may have to take a trip to Tasmania and Sydney to read those records. And you know, and there are, you know, records at the Archives of Ontario that I'm going to have to go to Toronto to look at too. And I've had a chance to look at some of those. Indian agents who are stationed at Walpole have kept. And then if this is the Leslie, I think it is, who works at the State Archives in Michigan.
Howsam?
No, that's the other Leslie. Leslie, Emeritus Professor, History Department at University of Windsor, Leslie. Integral to my progress through my academic career. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, Leslie Howsam. I know you'll let me know if I didn't.
Yeah, she probably will.
When Robert Engelbert mentioned, thank you for mentioning that. Oh yes, cat bombing. I just had a cat bombing here. Ecclesiastical and notary records, notarial records, super important. Absolutely. Thank you, Robert, for mentioning that. And a lot of this material is available online.
Yeah.
So, which is helpful.
Our next question comes from Rachel Kribbe, possibly. And she asks, how do you feel like knowing so much about the area's history affects how you feel about living in the Windsor-Detroit area today?
Great question, relative Rachel. I love that question. Montreal resident, singer-songwriter Rachel. I hope I'm not embarrassing her. But well, Rachel, you've done some writing. You've published pieces too about the Windsor-Detroit region. And haha. It's an interesting experience, and Guillaume can speak to this because we co-taught a course a few years back on the border. We attempted to, never had my phone ring so many times. We attempted to bring students together, which had its own legal complications, sort of crossing the border. It made me, doing the research, sort of, going beyond my experience growing up in this geography and thinking about it and connecting it with stories I had been told and trying to create a larger context and understand it that way and understand it from the scholarly perspective, which I need to do as part of this job, definitely makes me think about it differently. In some ways I feel like a stranger, not in a bad way, but in a way where you need a little bit of objectivity to be able to come back and look at your surroundings and see things more clearly. So I love and cherish that I'm able to come back here, to come back home, but I do understand this home as being something different now and part of a sort of a different historical world than what I might have imagined.
I don't know for you, Karen, but I feel I used to live close to the river, and now I live farther away from the river, so I don't drive by the river anymore as much. And I feel like it's easier to kind of, to feel that historical connection when you're by the river.
Yes.
So I feel like because I really don't see the river that much, despite the fact that I live in Windsor. Yeah, it's a different feeling, and yeah.
I think, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, Guillaume, go ahead.
No. Okay, no, I was just gonna say, I know you don't live by the river either, so.
I love that insight. I definitely concur with that insight. Even when I'm at work, when work is operating, it's Midtown Detroit, and you're not close to the river there either. The closer, I agree with you that there's something powerful, and there is in our scholarship, right? When we talk about the river and the water, and I'm talking about the sort of the stories I grew up hearing, they're all water focused. So I think that sort of transmutable or transnational identity is attached to the water, right? And now that I know the history from historians I greatly admire, from their work and your work, I understand why. And living on the American side of that border, the farther you get from the river, the less Canadian I feel. Yeah, because it's an interesting phenomenon. Like, don't quite know how to explain it. It's strange. Glad you brought that up.
We have time for just a few more questions. And so the next question comes from Dr. Robert Engelbert, also here at the University of Saskatchewan in Treaty 6 territory. This is a very Robert question. Are you ready?
Oh boy. Maybe only Robert can answer it. Go ahead.
Mixed, hybrid, hidden, etc. Ethnicity is very complicated. How did you grapple with multifaceted lived experiences that contribute to complex identities and cultures?
What a great Robert question. Just a great question in general. Thank you, Robert, for asking that. So, I'm going to go back to, I talked a little bit with Katie about this too on a previous occasion, but I'm going to go back to the fact that, this project has unfolded over 2 decades. And the scholarly terrain around how we talk about people who have multiple nation-based, for lack of a better term, even that's a fraught a term using nation, has changed, right? So how do I talk? And I've talked to you about this a lot, Robert. I know you and I've had many, Robert Engelbert, we've had many conversations about this. what do we call these people? When they didn't call themselves anything, right? Most of them didn't keep records. They might have signed an X, for their signature. So I'm reliant on how people spoke about them, especially when we're talking about the 18th century. And so I found myself sort of going to those church records who, those are, Récollet priests who are defining who they are, right? So it's an easy way for me to sort of use some of that terminology. But finding these people in all of these different places and all of these different archives and finding out that they're referenced differently in some of these places made me realize again how mutable these identities were. And when I wrote the chapter about Pontiac Sworn, about the two women who are supposed to have, the story, if you read the book, is that either one of these women, the reason why Indigenous people did not take down the fort at Detroit is because one of these two women, either Indigenous or French, told the British in advance, right? And so that's the simple story. But the fact that there are dueling accounts of who this woman was, on one hand, there was a French woman, she doesn't have any Indigenous blood, so to speak, if we're going to use that terminology, which is again, problematic. But she is part of these families I'm talking about. She's growing up, immersed in this culture. She speaks multiple Indigenous languages. She's interacting with Indigenous nations every day. Did she tell the British? Or Kathryn, who's an Ojibwe, probably an Ojibwe chief, and who's described in some of these sources as being Catholic, right? So she's got a hybrid, at least in the way these particular sources describe her, that is a mix of Indigenous, Catholic, which connotes French. There are two halves of a whole. I hesitate to sort of see it that way. But as many of you know, even sort of coming up with terminology, how do I refer to these people? It can't be Métis. These are not Métis people, right? The Métis nation, they're not members of the Métis nation, the Métis nation we recognize in Canada, the lands on which, the University of Saskatchewan resides that Katie talked about. So I'm still grappling with it. And I have, crazy me, I'm going to sort of meet this head on when I start looking at the Duriats in the 1830s and at what I think is going to be a pivotal moment, at least in the Detroit region, when these mutable categories actually come apart in some way. So Robert, not sure, did I talk around your question?
He said the complexity of your, there's lots. I will let you read the chat. Okay. Also, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat. I should stay focused. We actually just have one more question, and it's pretty direct, from Jay Gitlin, actually. And so the time is 1:30. So you don't know this, Karen, but I think it was 1:30. Jay wants to know which governor you mentioned, and I think.
Oh. Katie has frozen up.
He said, who is the governor you just mentioned?
Oh, who's the governor that I just mentioned? Maybe earlier when I was talking about the one that came from Tasmania. Are you talking about the one that came from? I mentioned Governor General Vaudreuil, and you know about him. Jay has written a lot of scholarship on early French-American settlement. And so Vaudreuil, we're talking about sort of the first a few decades of the early 18th century. Guillaume can correct me if I'm not entirely right. But the other governor I'm talking about, the one that came from Australia, Arthur, Sir George Arthur, I think his name is. I know the name, but of course it's escaping me at the moment.
Yeah, Jay says the one from Tasmania.
Arthur. And he's only lieutenant governor of Upper Canada for 1 year. in this very 1839. So Upper Canada rebellions are occurring, 1838, 1839, and the Patriot Wars are going on the American side of the border. They're trying to help the Canadians get out from under the, the reaches of the British, right? The mayor of Detroit is writing that he thinks there's going to be another revolution because the world has gone mad in Detroit because all of these people are gathering on both sides of the river. So I'm really interested to see how much Arthur took, because there's an incident while he's lieutenant governor of Tasmania called the Black War. And again, I've just started researching the Tasmania or Australia context. So my apologies if there are any Australian-based historians out there. But he was known as being, well, first of all, Van Diemen's Land was a penal colony for a lot of people. And people caught trying to rebel against the British government in places like Windsor could be sent all the way to Van Diemen's Land and sort of live out a pretty bad life there. But the policies Arthur sort of undertook against local Aboriginal people were merciless. They were very violent. So I will really want to delve into his correspondence and see whether I can draw any parallels between how he interacted with Indigenous people in Upper Canada and, based on his previous experiences.
Thank you. So we have come to the end of the question period. If there are more questions, maybe you can email Kathryn or come and hear her talk another time or read her book, and maybe the answer is in there. It has been my pleasure to moderate this session with Guillaume. And I think at this point, we turn it back over to Ariel, unless maybe Kathryn, you want to have something else to say, or Guillaume?
Well, I want to, I want to, first of all, thank, I have my thanks here, which I didn't read. So I want to thank Ariel because she got this thing up and moving, and she's been just fantastic about it. And it wouldn't have happened without Ariel's vision. I want to thank Katie. I want to thank Guillaume. I'm so lucky to be working in the same field as the two of them. I want to, at Michigan State University Press, I want to thank Julie Lohr, Bonnie Cobb, Amanda Frost, Christine Blakesley, and the cartographer who created the map I was talking about, Ellen White. And the idea for the this is a map from the William Clements collection at the University of Michigan, but it was my brother's idea to use this sort of detail of this map. So he's not on this call, he's busy, but I want to thank him. You guys are fantastic.
It was the very least that we could do, all of us, I'm sure.
And my colleagues, I have a lot of my colleagues on this call. Talk about supportive colleagues. Thank you so much for being here, all of you.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank so much Guillaume and Katie for being so amenable to taking time from their busy schedules and their children wandering in and out of their screens and their days, and Kathryn's cats and all the people phoning her. I'd like to thank them as well for visual entertainment, if nothing else. So I'm going to hold the book up because that's what you do at book launches. You look at the book. I've put the codes in the chat one last time if anyone would like to order the books. I'd also like to remind you that our next launch, you can find more details about all the launches we have in September and October. We're launching some really great Indigenous titles that many of you, I'm sure, would be interested in. The next one, as I mentioned, is September 24th. It's this one, Decolonizing Discipline, which is based on some of the call to actions from the Truth and Reconciliation report. But I'm just so pleased to have had this launch. I'm so proud of this book and of Kathryn. I think that's it. So if you guys want to stick around and chat, like I see that there was another question in the chat. we can stop the formal part of the presentation, but if you want to move over to the chat and answer questions, you can do that.
I mean, you folks, I know everybody's busy. So I'll stay behind and answer any questions. And if anybody wants to, I do hope you buy the book. I mean, some of you already have. I have an amazingly supportive network of people. Talk about networks spanning vast distances. I have them and I'm grateful. But you can find me. I'm an associate professor at Wayne State University in the history department, as Ariel mentioned. You can find me easily on our website and Karen.Marrero at wayne.edu. So email me. I'd be happy to take questions over email too. So I'll stay behind, and I want to thank you folks, all three of you, and thank you so much again. Merci beaucoup.
De rien.
So Ariel, you'll leave this up and running until Karen
Yeah,
is.
I'll leave it up and running for a few minutes, but if you guys want to shuffle off screen, you have my permission.
Okay, well, I do have to go, so I mean, I could talk about this with these people for days and days and days, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to carve out this time today. And congratulations, Karen. It's an amazing book. Everybody go and buy it and read it, and maybe someday we'll all get together in person to talk about it too.
Great. Thank you, Katie.
Thank
Bye.
you. Okay, bye.
Oh, thank you. Merci
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking time. Thank you for your
Congratulations.
scholarship too.
We'll be in touch, I'm sure.
Okay. Thank you so much, Guillaume.
Okay, thank
See
you.
you later. So I'm still here for whoever wants to. Oh, Monty, thank you. I mean, I'm seeing all the comments from everybody, and great scholars and great folks on this list. Why is there's a huge price difference between US and Canadian prices? Jenny, yay, Jenny. Don't leave yet, Jenny, because
I can answer that.
okay, so can I just, I got these wonderful flowers from Ginny Bales and Jay Gitlin. They arrived just before my talk, and I want to thank them very much for that. So, okay, the question about pricing, go ahead, Ariel.
Yeah, U of M Press only does what are called trade books, or mostly only does what are trade books. So, you know, like a cardboard cover and a sort of a standard spine. And we price our books as in trade prices. So our books are in the range of 29 to 30 something, depending on page numbers and different things like that, and number of graphics. We don't control what MSUP charges for their books, but I will note that their book is a hardcover. And so that can account for some of the differences in price, but yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Answer.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Want to say hi to Marlene Medrano. I'm so happy she's here. Adriana Gressy Green, who does some excellent work on Anishinaabe of Michigan. God, what a great bunch of people. So lucky. I'm so lucky. Oh, so I'm looking to see if there are any questions. So I know there were a few things. I know Rob Faf was here. I don't know if you're still here, Rob, but so historical silences, yeah. A little bit more about challenges of research across various archives and sources. Teaching one of your chapters next week to my students. Perfect timing. Thank you, Rob. I might have said a little bit about this, but if I haven't completely covered this, oh, Rob is still here. Hi, Rob. Like I think I mentioned a little bit before that there were more women in these sources than I had. When I first started this project as a dissertation, I wasn't going to focus on women. I just was going to focus on the families, right? So it's even still now in its final iteration, it doesn't completely commit to looking at women and gender, but it does to a large extent. So I went in with my own suppositions as a woman that now I sort of regret. There was an incident when Northern Superintendent of Indian Affairs William Johnson comes from the Mohawk Valley in upstate New York, and he comes to Detroit right after the 7 Years' War. It's 1761. And he keeps a diary, and this is published as part of his published papers. And he talks about the commandant, the newly installed British commandant, greeting him. And he has these parties with these women, French women, I'm assuming they're French women, in town. And he talks about what he eats and what he drinks. You know, he meets with them at the commandant's house. He drinks cordials, I think that's what it is, and rusk and all of these things I had to look up because I didn't know what they were. So when I first read this, I didn't really actually think about this critically. Like, I didn't think critically about my own gender biases that I sort of, and this was a number of years ago, I just really thought, oh, these are, you know, peripheral women who are married to important men, French men in the community, and they're just greeting him. But of course, you know, committing as I did to looking at women in this book, I found out, and then doing research on who they probably were. And one of them is mentioned, and she is the French woman at the heart of the story of Pontiac's War, Angélique Cuillertier, that these women were, they were women who were integrally involved in trade, who controlled trade at Detroit, right? And then, and benefiting from understanding this concept of the procuratrice, and I thank Robert Engelbert for really educating me on that point, that they were, I could sort of decide who they probably were, and the fact that Johnson coming in and the British not just wanting to have military control, but having commercial or economic control, that was absolutely essential that he meet with these women and sort of curry favor with them so that the British could start to conduct trade. So, you know, I'm always telling my students to be wary of their biases against seeing women as being integral to the history, but I had to overcome those biases of my own. I even worried when I first thought about going the route of doing a history of women and gender that, and a number of my scholarly colleagues that are on this call who have been doing this work a lot longer than I have will know that it was a lonely exercise that they were engaged in like decades ago. The history of women of this period or this place was sort of marginalized away from the main corpus of what historians were writing about. But because of the work that these women did, and hopefully the work I'm doing, we're sort of trying to collapse some of those artificial ahistorical boundaries. So did I answer your question, Rob? I hope so. Is there, oh, Rob, you're so great. Thank you, Rob. Any other questions that I did not get to, or? I'm just looking through. If you want to, I mean, I probably will, okay, good. I have to go feed my cats. If whoever is still here, I want to reiterate, I am so grateful to you for being here, taking time. It's such a busy time, especially for teachers and academics. And I really, really, really appreciate it and appreciate your work. Thank you. I'll see you guys. Ariel, thank you so much. Yay, Jay, love to you. Okay, bye everybody.